Good afternoon, everyone. If I can have your attention. My name is Erwin Bodvarson, and I'm Interim Dean of the School of Public Affairs and Professor of Economics here at SCSU, and I'd like to welcome you all to Day 2 of the Global Goes Local Conference. As one of the co-founders of the Faculty Research Group on Immigrant Workers in Minnesota, I've taken great pride in seeing how this conference has grown in success and attendance over the last 3 years. This is the third consecutive year of this conference, and it seems like the show just gets more and more exciting. We're having great turnout at our panels. We're having great turnout at our keynotes, and I'm particularly happy to see so many students here. Clearly, migration and policy issues related to immigration are important topics to students, and that pleases those of us that are part of the research group very much. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Steve Fillion, who will be introducing our keynote speaker. I would like, however, to just put a plug in, kind of a personal thing regarding our keynote. I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Immanuel Ness in Lucknow, India in December of 2008. We were both giving papers at the Indian Society of Labor Economics Conference in Lucknow, which is about 400 miles east of Delhi. And my first time in India, but I think it was not his first time. I think he's traveled quite a bit in India. But we had a very nice conversation. It was one of those very temperate December evenings, and I think we'd had a nice sort of open buffet curry dinner, and very nice conversation. And I think we had no idea, Manuel, that our paths would be crossing here and like we'll be gone. So particularly pleased to have you here. So Steve, why don't you introduce our speaker? Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Bodvarson, and thank you very much for the support you've shown for this research group for the last 3 years as Dean of, this year as Dean of School of Public Affairs, and also, of course, to the other Dean from College of Liberal Arts, Mark Springer, who's also been key in supporting the research group. I go through all the list of the sponsors and the like, but since we've had the slideshow going for the last 10 minutes or so, you're kind of already familiar with them. But thank you to all of our sponsors who made this possible. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Immanuel Ness, known as Manny, to this group and to St. Cloud State University. He's a professor of political science at Brooklyn College. He's published scholarly monographs on unemployment, precarious labor, migration, guesswork, syndicalism, and new worker organizations. His projects include new working class movements and organizations, protest and revolution, socialist theory, and urban politics. He's published numerous articles and books on immigrant labor, including most notably immigrants, unions, and the U.S. labor market, and guest workers and resistance to U.S. corporate despotism. Both books have proven to be hugely successful and very well received by students that I teach and that other professors in sociology have taught here at St. Cloud State. And so I think, based on that experience that I've had with teaching his books, and also, of course, the way in which he takes the topic of immigration as one which requires to not just think of immigrants and immigrant workers as victims, but as active agents of political and social change. I think he very much fits the spirit of the way in which our research group approaches collaboration with the immigrant community. So in any event, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Immanuel Ness, and his topic is neoliberal markets, migration, and guest workers. Please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Ness.
Thank you for that introduction, Stephen, Professor Fillion. I'm very happy to be here at St. Cloud State University, and I'm also happy that so many people are at this conference. It gives me great enthusiasm and hope to see an organization that is forming and growing to become something that's truly special, not just for the upper Midwest, but also for all of us around the country. And I would also like to thank Interim Dean Orrin Bodvarson for his introductory comments and for inviting me. And also thank mainly the students who are here, as well as all those people I know here who are always friendly to me and give me the time to explain my thoughts and to have great discussions, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion, and I won't devote myself exclusively to this slideshow. However, that might happen. If it does, please cut me off. Anyway, I came to this discussion, neoliberal markets, migration, and guest workers, from a great concern with respect to U.S. and global policies that are emerging in the last 15 years or so. Increasingly, we're seeing a replacement of certain types of migration that have historically been in place. And so what I'll do is just go through the slides, and we can go to the major arguments and perhaps have a discussion. Okay. First, much of the present debate on immigration policy revolves around the failure and unintended consequences of utterly consistent U.S. government policies to establish and regulate the flow of authorized and unauthorized migrants. Ineffectual regulatory policies have bifurcated migrant workers into two groups with irregular status. Of course, there are documented immigrants in the United States, but the two groups that have irregular status are undocumented migrants, as Professor Milton spoke of yesterday, and guest workers who are growing in number, and that's just an estimate. So there's about 4 or 5 times as many undocumented workers in the United States as there are guest workers. So through focusing on guest workers rather than undocumented laborers indicates the prospects and pitfalls of the program for foreign workers as well as U.S. nationals, which is something that I also take into consideration, as do many migration scholars, and the potential influence of the program on the labor movement. If we find out in corporate efforts to replace undocumented laborers with an established guest worker labor force, we find them successful, conditions for all workers will significantly diminish in my estimation. Well, anyway, here's kind of a boilerplate example of a Marxist analysis, comes from 1867, Das Kapital, of what a reserve army of labor is. I won't go through this in depth. All I'll say is that capital desires a reserve army of labor, which is really a high level of workers who are able to work, and many who are unemployed. And by having such a flexible labor force and a large labor force, capital is able to maneuver to a larger degree and lower wages, which is one of the major components of profits. I think that Marx's argument in 1867 is as relevant then as it is today, perhaps more so, as we see workers increasingly flooding certain labor markets and diminishing the cost of work, which is increasing surplus value for the employers. So this chart here essentially gives you a picture of what the reserve army of labor looks like, and why it is at a specific condition that contributes to what people are now referring to as precarity. And these numbers are growing. Obviously, there's a large literature on the subject of how labor and how capital markets have changed over time. But I'll leave that for another time. Just essentially, we're now 26 years since the last, as Professor Milton pointed out yesterday, the last migration legislation. And I think over that period of time, we have gone through an era in which capital, corporations, and the government have tacitly approved undocumented migration, or as some people would prefer to call people illegally crossing the border or overstaying their visas illegally. So what capital has decided, along with government actors, who seem to almost always slavishly follow what the major interest groups and corporations seek in national federal legislation in the United States, is a guest worker program. And this guest worker program, on many different levels, enlarged since about, you could say, since the late 80s, early 90s. So it's more like 20 years. This is not just true for the United States, but it's also true in different ways in other parts of the world, particularly Canada and parts of Europe. Although Europe is very different than North America because they have a mobile labor force rooted in the EU, it is also dependent on workers who are likely not to stay for a long period of time, which is troubling for a lot of people who think of immigrant communities and how they will establish themselves over a period of time if they come only temporarily, which is different in some ways than undocumented migration, where people do have a historical memory. I'm reminded of Leon Fink's book on the Mayans of Morganton, where he talks about the establishment of a cohesive community in Morganton, North Carolina, of Guatemalan Mayans, and in chicken farm industry, I believe. And in this context, there is a group of people who know each other and interact with one another. Yes, they're undocumented and so forth, and they have families and children and grandchildren that will leave a historical memory. I would also say that there is a connection between undocumented migration and guest worker programs, because if U.S. legislation passes from both parties, which are equally, in my view, quite draconian, if any of that legislation for comprehensive immigration reform passes, the rights of migrants or immigrants in this country will be diminished significantly, but so will U.S. workers. I don't make a distinction. I make that very clear between workers in the United States. People are either born here or they're not. And if you're either foreign-born or U.S.-born workers, but you're still members of the working class if you work here. You affect the labor markets in this country and profits. So my major focus in this discussion is on H-2B guest workers. However, I will touch on H-2A guest workers, and maybe a little bit on H-1B guest workers, and I'll explain what they are, who they are. But for those people who are H-2B guest workers, they generally come to the United States from the Caribbean, primarily or almost exclusively now from Jamaica, under extremely adverse conditions. Just think of it, kind of, what would you think of an indentured servant might be? An indentured servant might be somebody who has to pass a test to come to the United States. Not just a test on proficiency, on whether they can cook, bake, clean, or do a whole range of jobs, but also on the basis of whether they have specific health conditions that the employer or contractor may not like, and also on the basis of their attitudes and so forth that are, with precision, I must say, discerned by the contractors. And much of the literature talks about the contractors working for small businesses and so forth. There is a degree of truth to that, but major hotels also employ guest workers. Major resorts employ guest workers. The Michigan Upper Peninsula is a major place for guest workers from Jamaica. People who work at Starbucks who make sandwiches in Aspen, Colorado, employ guest workers. But essentially they have very few rights. I don't see number one, but maybe I passed that. There are highly onerous work arrangements. There's the withholding of wages that takes place. What I mean by that is that if you do not complete your assignment, or even if you do, wages will be withheld until you finish, so that approximately 1/3, which is essentially what you will make or bring home, will be withheld until you arrive back at your country of origin. And why is that so important? Because many people don't finish their contracts, in which case they lose everything. In addition to that, they also lose the money they pay to fly to the United States. We're not talking about people who arrive here in the United States or other places for free. They must pay to get here. They must pay for lodging. They must pay for food. And they must only work for one employer. If they lose their job, unlike H-2A workers who are more skilled, they have to leave the country immediately. And of course, they have lack of access to employment, federal employment regulations governing minimum wage and hour standards. Now, I say that because of the research I've done. I did research both in the United States as well as in Jamaica, which is the major place of official guest workers that come to the United States, as opposed to people who are undocumented guest workers, which is also a possibility. What I found in Jamaica was extremely disturbing. Many people did not complete their contracts. Many people stayed for less than the entire period of time, which is actually substantiated not just with respect to the United States, but also in terms of other countries. So, for instance, Vietnamese guest workers who are employed in Taiwan as domestic workers, the vast majority, or at least over half, go home before the completion of their contracts because of the way they're treated. So we're really not looking at a U.S. phenomenon. We're looking at a global phenomenon that is, I think, the dominant wave of the future. Here's a chart that gives you a sense of where guest workers are from. Forgive me for the formatting problems. Essentially, the largest majority by far in absolute numbers are from the United States or North America. Canada has a comprehensive immigration plan that is more amenable to migration than does the United States. The major places are obviously Europe, North America, and Oceania. So why do so many migrant workers participate in such an exploitative system, you might ask? You know, if you go back to Jamaica, or you travel to Jamaica and you ask people who participate in the system, and there are some really amazing examples. You go to the sites where they are recruited, and you also go to places where people work in essentially recreational hospitality jobs, and they give you a sense of what happened when they were here. And they did not particularly like it for the most part. It was I asked open-ended questions that were rooted in what Mario Tronti would argue was co-research, where I did not extract from them the information, but I allowed them to interact and provide a sense of their own being and their experiences, as well as sharing some of my experiences with them and acknowledging their concerns. Tronti's work does inform a lot of the research I do, which is some people might call ethnographic, and I think that we as students and researchers should also not just take, we should also give back to our to those people that we do research with. So again, here we find that the conditions in places like Jamaica and elsewhere are blighted, impoverished, and so forth. Many of this impoverishment takes place as a result of global multilateral organizations that have imposed restrictions and engage in what is referred to as structural adjustment on economies like Jamaica and throughout the world. The deregulation of the world economy, opening up of tariffs, eliminating all tariffs and trade barriers, opening up countries to the ability for capital to move very quickly in and out and so forth. This could immediately create significant difficulties for countries who are seeking to provide free education or at least low-cost education, or healthcare, or housing, and so forth. And many of the migrant workers I spoke to came to the United States to educate their niece or nephew, or were coming to the United States because they wanted to pay for health care for a member of their family who was unwell in some ways. And they were able to do that. And in my view, I think that countries should be able to do that independently. I mean, what's so interesting also, kind of a conundrum for me, is that the life expectancy for Jamaica and many countries in the Caribbean is about equal to the United States. But yet at the same time, they don't have things like kidney dialysis and heart transplants. I don't think most people would get that, but kidney dialysis anyway. I make the argument, as do others, that skilled and unskilled workers are filling important spaces in the U.S. economy, and they, as I was arguing earlier, there is no prospect of establishing a foundation of power and support. There's no permanency except for the H-2A worker, who we'll see in a moment are highly skilled workers that have the opportunity to stay in the country after several times that they go back. So essentially we have this chart, so to speak, destination dependent services. In destination countries who have skilled occupations, they tend to be H-2A workers who are engaged in internet technology, programmers, business services, and so forth and so on. Nursing and doctors are also a major force. Semi-skilled, I've only added one, which would be welding and construction, but there are also other fields that people who are engaged in legal, what we're calling legal migration programs, guest worker programs. But there are some very important cases with respect to welding and construction, particularly in the U.S. South. And then you have what are referred to as lower skilled jobs, domestic services, which is country dependent with respect to guest workers. Canada does have a guest worker program. The United States does not with respect to people who perform domestic services in others' homes. Hospitality work in hotels and restaurants and entertainment facilities, tourism, fishermen and processors, and landscaping is primarily a Mexican job in the United States as a guest work program. I'm not referring to people who are in the agricultural sectors of the economy, which also constitute a very large segment of the population. Here I'm just very quickly going to say that the United States constantly permits these programs to enlarge over time. Although they say there are penalties and so forth, as I was intimating earlier, those penalties are rarely assigned to the employers, just like was the case in employer sanctions. Employers can freely not pay workers the minimum wage. They can assess what the prevailing wage is below the minimum wage. In many cases that's the case, particularly for those people in lower levels of skills. And the argument that is provided by people in conservative think tanks and some liberal think tanks is that Americans are not interested in these jobs, or they're not qualified in these jobs. And I actually argue that that's not necessarily the case, if not the case at all. I think that if people paid workers enough money or remunerated them enough, that those jobs would be valuable, just like a half century ago. People wanted to work in jobs that could provide for themselves and their families. However, due to a confluence of circumstances, employers are arguing that IT professionals in certain parts of the world are capable of doing jobs better than U.S. workers can. And I think we have to be, I'm very sympathetic to migrant workers and immigrants as a whole, and I think we all should be. But we should also be careful not to have an all-encompassing argument. In this case, I've seen examples of people in IT in the United States training foreign workers in places like Siemens Incorporated, Goldman Sachs, and a number of other companies. They're training U.S. workers training guest workers and then being replaced. So these are serious questions that also leads to the disturbing development of nativism and xenophobia in this country against people who are from other places. Oops, wrong slide. Where's my space? This is just a general picture of the first wave of migration. Not the first one, but the one that we know all about, of the colonial powers essentially establishing colonies throughout the world. Go through that quickly. This table really shows a shift that has taken place from the north to the south, forgive me, from the south to the north. And you can see that the biggest circles, I don't have the exact data, forgive me, but at this moment it's not necessary, are places that are, Australia and Oceania is not there, are in North America and Europe, as well as the Arab Gulf states or Persian Gulf states, however you want to put that. There's also south-south migration, and that really accounts for the African cases where many people migrate, for instance, in West Africa, in the Sahel, in the region there because of civil war and refugee status and so forth. And there's an effort to regularize that. This is just I just want to give you images. So a picture of the windbrush. I don't know if anyone knows what the windbrush is. Anyone know offhand? It was the first ship to dock in England. It was the first Jamaican ship. Actually, it's probably a British ship that docked in England, and it was the first wave of migrants there who came actually there to work right before independence in Jamaica, and I thought it would be relevant to this discussion. But just to show you that many of the people who migrated did so for a variety of reasons, including professional workers who were engaged in work and became engaged in work in the UK. And you'll notice there are also women there that are very important. Here's a 2010 figure for countries that are destinations, and it also reflects some interesting trends. The main argument here is that the United States is the primary receiver of, largest receiver of migrants in the world, and it would like to establish a global policy on that basis. I mean, we can go through each of those countries and explain why people have migrated, but I don't think we have time. Actually, we absolutely don't have time. And this also kind of confirms things. The number of international migrants are now up to about 210 million by 2010 or 2012. I'm supposed to go to a PDF file to show you global remittances. But I don't know how to do that, so we'll skip it. Maybe after. Then we have various regions where you can see the degree to which the remittances, what are remittances? First of all, that was what I was going to show you initially. They are the amounts of money that go back to the home country. And I would make the case that in very few cases, very few instances, do you find actually countries benefiting from these remittances. They may help families, they may help small communities here and there, but just take a look at Mexico, which is the primary, in Central America, the primary sending region in the world, and you can see that it is probably one of the most impoverished regions of the world. What might be more interesting, and there's very little data on this, and I'd like to collect it, is not just GDP, gross domestic product, as a percentage of the national income, but also the balance of trade. And if you examine a number of these countries, you'll find that balance of trade is takes up a significant share of the total. So for instance, in a place like Mexico, migration hovers between first and third in terms of balance of trade. Oil being the first, the second would be perhaps tourism, but I think migration has superseded tourism. Currently, I'm not exactly sure. And you'll notice the gray areas are places where people don't actually receive remittances whatsoever. And those are places where people actually work. It's kind of interesting to note that. The New Zealand example is kind of an outlier because a lot of people in New Zealand actually go to Australia to work. They usually come from the UK via Africa. And this is one of the forms of labor migration that is increasing. When you're trained in Africa, you might be trained in South Africa and then move to England and then to New Zealand, and then since it's a beautiful country, many people feel it's underpopulated, so they move to Australia, which also has a small relative population. And you can see the same trends in Latin America, also again taking into consideration the fact that we're looking at GDP and not balance of trade. Balance of trade again is the amount of money each country takes in on the basis of trade. This just shows the degree to which migration has increased just in the last decade on a global scale, and most of this migration is based on guest workers. This table gives you kind of another example of what we were referring to before with respect to those places that people migrate, and actually a better map because it shows Australia and South America to a greater extent. And you'll note that the largest circles, which I think constitute over 1 million people per year, are in North America and in Europe. And you can see the breakout map over there. This is a very interesting example of the ways in which people migrate around the world. It's also true with respect to the ending of guest work policies for many African workers, particularly people who have traveled from the Sahel, which is a region in this lower left corner of the map of Africa, to the Maghreb, and the degree to which there's interdiction, although this map was produced before the war in Libya, and it doesn't give you the degree to which Libyan migrants constitute such a large segment of that population there, and many of them have been displaced and killed as part of the Civil War, which is what I'm going to call it. Here's an example of remittances that come back, and this also intersects with Professor Milton's presentation yesterday on the degree to which various communities are dependent, even if it doesn't necessarily develop those economies, but dependent on remittances, and that is declining dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years since the major economic crisis. Once again, the United States is the highest and remains and is continuing to grow. You can see the various countries and how they shift as the major destination of migration. Again, that we can go into that. My argument is that capital needs low-wage immigrants or migrants, and if it cannot get cheap labor through new migration law, undocumented immigrant workers will continue to work in the U.S. economy under constant threat of deportation, which is happening, as was pointed out earlier. U.S. businesses favor a guest work program without a path to citizenship, I make that point clearly, to reinforce control over a foreign labor force, which will fear union organizing and is exposed to human rights violations. And if a new policy is advanced, which I don't really support, and I can tell you why, that generally enhances the guest work program, workers will cross borders legally, but under onerous and exploitative conditions that are as abusive as indentured servitude. And I don't say that lightly. Only workers will not have the opportunity to buy their freedom as they had in the 19th century, in some places, the United States, for instance. And so, working class and migrant worker resistance, what Stephen was talking about, or Professor Fillion was talking about earlier, I see different perspectives from based on who you're looking at. So in the United States, you have, as I was pointing out earlier, examples of nativism, where people, and was pointed out in the presentations yesterday and today on nativism, factory occupations by even US-born workers, and disruption and sabotage. There were a number of examples, as I pointed out earlier, in IT factories or operations. So what can guest workers do? Well, they can escape, which is really probably the most effective way of becoming an undocumented worker in the United States, and perhaps being treated better. They can engage in work organization and unionization in certain industries, such as nursing industries, labor markets such as nursing and education, but frequently those are the minority of cases. We do have a number of factory occupations that have occurred, not just in the United States, but in other places. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the example of the Signal International case, where oil service workers who were actually living in a plant they were living in Pascagoula, Mississippi, which is one of the leading shipyards in the United States, the 2 or 3 leading shipyards. And Signal International is an oil services company, and they hired welders from Kerala and Tamil Nadu in southern and eastern India. And these workers were, I consider actually welders kind of skilled workers. Think about how many welders we actually have. Maybe not in Minnesota. I mean, in New York, certainly there are very few welders. It's very difficult to get a job as a welder or to get an education as a welder. It's difficult also to get an education as a nurse in the United States or other kinds of key professions. But what happened at Signal International is very interesting. The workers were treated so badly, they obviously have to pay for where they live. They were expecting to get green cards down the road, but they paid something like $50,000 to contractors in Mumbai, on average $40,000 to $50,000 for the right to work in the United States. And so the Signal International contracted them to work. This is in 2007, 2008. And these workers actually were living in trailers in the factory, gigantic factory. So they're living in trailers, 20 to a trailer, according to the testimony of the workers and also the legal authorities, with one bathroom. They had to start work in 12-hour shifts and so forth, or even longer. Conditions were abysmal. They were getting paid lower wages than they expected. And so they essentially stopped work, in effect taking over the factory, because in this case you had people actually living in the factory in these gigantic, these trailer homes. So all work ceased for a period of time. There was a hunger strike, efforts to deport many of these workers. So it just shows you that there is a degree to which workers are not of any kind, are not afraid, even at the risk of being deported to, and even losing $50,000 in some instances or more, to engage in different types of social protest. And so there are other examples that can be discussed with respect to the Zapatistas in 1995 when NAFTA was put forward, which allowed capital a lot of rights and corporations a lot of rights, but no rights for workers to have their jobs secured on all 3 borders of the US, Canada, and Mexico. And some people actually do return to their places of origin and feel like that's before the end of their shift, even though they do get ripped off by their employers. Some are, in many cases, are not forced to go back because they're treated so badly in the United States. That's the end of the presentation, except for the remittances chart, which is fine. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes of time for Q&A. Stop recording.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ness, for a wonderful presentation. So I have a couple of observations. Maybe you can comment on those observations. One is basically that you're talking about, when you talk about the legal, political rights and the terminology of, H-1B or H-2A and all of that, we're essentially talking about constructing labor conditions in particular ways. So oftentimes they get constructed in political terms or in culturalist terms and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to sort of draw your attention to two key concepts, which I think is important to sort of, think about the process of construction of workers, in peculiar ways, which is really essentially a part of an extraction of totalitarian itself. So the two concepts are, one is drawn from Neil Smith, the idea of uneven development, which you sort of, there were a lot of resonances to uneven development in the kind of stuff we talked about, imbalance of trade and all of that stuff. And the other is really Marx's notion of social relations of production itself. Basically, if you think about production as, labor, labor processes and production processes necessarily, then those who labor are constructed in particular ways, or rather the social relations within which they're implicated, they sort of perform their labor are constructed in certain ways to maximize this surplus extraction. So, but then the construction of that social relations of production is not merely here in the United States or in the receiving country. There is a simultaneous process that happens back where they come from. So that's basically a complex matrix, which I think is a useful concept to really sort of tie the two together. That's one thing. And secondly, when I finish my observations, and then you can go ahead and respond. The second thing is, we have been, over the, around the world, we've been talking about, globalization for about like 20 odd years or more. I think one of the areas of globalization that has been least discussed is really globalization of potential labor solidarity.
Okay.
From drawing on from what you're talking about, how this construction of work impacts, local, American workers and guest workers or immigrant workers at the same time. I think it's really important to sort of start talking about such solidarities across international borders.
That's a very, very good point. I'll be as brief as possible. Absolutely, I think the notion that Neil Smith and others, even Louis Althusser, had put forward on imbalances, which we can apply to this discussion, and uneven development is critical. I was just mentioning to Donna Gabaccia a few moments ago, Professor Gabaccia, that, everybody's calling each other professor, that we really have emerged from a period of imperialism about 30 years ago, the end of colonialism actually, 30, 35 years ago, to one where those imbalances that are placed in the world are advantaged. I think I skipped a few slides that talked about the question of the ways in which certain countries have advantages through cheaper labor, and maybe because they have higher levels of social welfare in those countries, it allows for people to migrate from one place to another. But and so there's absolutely a very important, in my view, line of argument to be made with respect to understanding how imbalances are used by a global system to facilitate profits and also to take advantage of peoples from around the world. And one of the cases I looked at was Hyderabad, India, where you had migrant workers from rural areas, and many people, in many cases, they were migrant workers from rural areas in the Hyderabad greater area, it's called Telangana, who were working to build IT and accountancy facilities in Hyderabad, and they were living in plastic tents and treated very badly based on their caste and class, hardly being able to exist. On the question of transnational solidarity, I think is one that is just emerging, and I think there are several good examples that we can look to. One would be the farm laborers organizing committees, organization of Mexican workers before they come to the United States into unions, and they had a successful campaign in North Carolina around Mount Olive 5 years ago or so, 6 years ago. And then there's also the example in India where you have people throughout India going on hunger strikes along with the workers on those hunger strikes, along with people in the unions, right? You know, India has many unions and union federations supporting those efforts of these workers who were exploited. I think that as we see these trends expand, and I think that's the case, we'll find we need to find ways of resistance. Just very briefly, I hope I answered your question or responded to this.
Yeah, I just. Is it on? Yeah, I know I had just a small factual question about what you said at the beginning about different kinds of temporary workers, because I understood the Jamaican and maybe Haitians come to Florida for sugarcane work. I think that's an H-2 visa, and then there's the people, the students from Argentina or who go to Aspen, or the students from I think Scandinavian Europe who go to the Dells in Wisconsin, and or au pair workers who are students, but I don't think they're presented with the idea that maybe they're presented with the idea that it's an opportunity rather than work in a sense. But I wonder if do they all technically go through the same process for the visa? It's the same kind of visa?
No, actually, it's a very good point that you raised that I didn't have time to. And that's the whole issue of J1 and F1 visas for exchange students, which was established under the Soviet-Russian era, and then foreign students who were in the United States. And many of them are so-called trainees in the United States. And this is also true of the Caribbean, as so-called skilled workers. And you might have all remembered last summer there was the large controversy over the Hershey workers from Eastern Europe. These were youths who were expecting to learn management and business skills at Hershey Corporation in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And many of them worked 6-day weeks and may have had a class or so. I found the same thing happening amongst Jamaican workers who felt, well, you know, I have a career in the hospitality industry. Maybe someday I'll own a hotel or something like that, or be a manager. And they find out that they work as housekeepers almost all the time, or as restaurant workers. And the indignities that these people face, I mean, they're workers too, absolutely workers who are not even paid. They have to pay to actually be accepted into the United States. And the indignities that they face are amazing, particularly those who come from the Caribbean and countries where people are not Caucasian. The Caribbean is particularly, as you were mentioning, Haiti as well. I think you're referring primarily to people who are in the agricultural sector. And in Canada, you find the same examples amongst Guatemalan workers who are treated very badly, and they've developed worker centers to address their concerns.